I want to say welcome to the fifth talk in the series on critical perspectives on technology. I, as many of you know now, organized this lectures series as a part of my project on exceptional norms, marginalized bodies in interaction design. My name is Katja Spiel, and I'm a Herta Firnberg postdoctoral scholar at TU Wien, where I research marginalized perspectives on technology to inform critical design and engineering. But today you're here to hear from Selma. Selma Šabanović is an associate professor of informatics and cognitive science at Indiana University Bloomington. And her research combines the critical study of computing with research on human-robot interaction. She particularly focuses on the design, use, and consequences of socially interactive robots in different cultural contexts. And her work has explored social robot applications in healthcare, education, and the home, and includes comparative studies of robot design and user perceptions in the US and Japan. She serves as editor-in-chief of the ACM Transactions on Human-Robot Interaction, and she recently co-authored the book Human-Robot Interaction and Introduction, published by Cambridge University Press. Her presentation is titled Robots for Us, Participatory and Community-Centered Design of Robots. So you can ask questions during and after the presentation in the chat window, or however Selma instructs you to. So afterwards, we will all be in discussion, which is led by Astrid Weiss. And Astrid Weiss is currently a senior researcher at the Institute of Visual Computing and Human-Centered Technology at TU Wien, where I also sit. And we actually shared an office until recently. And her project, Shared Space, exploring long-term human-robot interaction, was financed by the Elise Richter program of the FWF, the Austrian Science Fund, and investigates long-lasting connections between humans and servers or companion robots. Astrid is one of the Austria's key figures in the interdisciplinary research of human-robot interaction. Let me say, I asked her to give me a bio, but let me say she's like the key figure in Austria. But anyway, this is evidenced by numerous articles, lectures, and conference organizations. So she's going to head HRI, the conference in the field, in 2022 as a general chair. Her special interest lies in the effects of technology on everyday life and what motivates people to reject or accept technology. But for now, I would ask Selma to take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation with you. And so what I'll do, I'll share the screen now, and I have a presentation, but do feel free to stop me. And I think if you question in the chat, I'm not 100% sure I can see it while I'm showing. So if somebody wants to just kind of stop me or even unmute yourself and just say, hey, can we ask a question? That's totally fine. So just alert me if there's a question that I seem to not be paying attention to. I'm happy to stop anytime. Okay, let's share. So today I'm going to talk about some of the work that we do in my lab that has to do with kind of the participatory and community-centered design of social robots. And I'm going to give a narrative that spans things that we've done for basically the past decade. So there's things we did quite a while ago, and then things that we've done that we're still basically doing. So, so you'll see kind of a range of different projects. And to give you a little bit of an idea of where I come from, and so where my work comes from and what it's informed by. So I have a background in science and technology studies, which is what I have my PhD in. And my initial interests in this field were in kind of the question of what is really social about robots? How do people design that kind of feature into a machine? And so that's what my PhD was on. And I did basically lab studies of social robotics laboratories in the US and Japan. And through those lab studies, I recognized that the questions that social scientists often ask themselves are actually very similar to the questions that robotics researchers ask themselves when they design these kind of technologies. And then I got more deeply embroiled in the social robotics and community, and also the human robot interaction community as the kind of connector between technical development, kind of philosophical questions, social science questions, and just even questions about the place and consequences of robotic technology for society. So now I had a lab where we do studies that range from in-lab experiments to field studies in actual spaces. Today, I'm going to be talking more about the kind of field study side of our work. But really, we're problem-centered, so we're kind of methodologically agnostic. We'll do whatever it takes to answer the question. So a lot from the very beginning, I was kind of intrigued by this notion of having robots that we think are social and that actually can coexist with people in day-to-day life. And of course, you're all probably familiar with this is a discourse that's everywhere in the media today, but also in discussions of researchers who envision their work really informing what happens in the day-to-day life of various types of people. And in this particular picture, you see everything from older adults to kids to, you know, any of us that might have a package delivered at any point, which I think all of us are ever more familiar with now, since we can't actually go get things for ourselves all the time. But I think I'm interested in this kind of space of how do we imagine this this coming to be, and then what kinds of values or what kinds of ideas of what's important or what benefits might be do we inscribe in these technologies? And one of the issues that many people have brought up with not just robotics, but all kinds of technology is that they're often invoked as a kind of what STS folks call a technical fix to social problems. So in a lot of, if you read a social robotics paper, including I am sometimes guilty of this, or a human robot interaction paper, the first few paragraphs will inevitably be telling you about how there's X problem, and we are going to design this technology or study this technology or something like that to help address that problem. And we've seen this in work from the very beginning of the field. So I just pulled some examples of things that social robotics researchers talk about kind of influencing in the social world. So Rodney Brooks, who was the head of the CSAI lab at MIT, and he's also kind of been involved in many commercial robotics products like the Roomba, which many of you have probably seen, but also Baxter and some others. He, from the beginning, talked about the notion that if we have robots in our everyday lives, we're going to see an objective increase in our standard of living, for example. Or we often see these notions of, well, you know, if we construct this robot to work with people in a certain way, it's going to make people's lives easier. This is from a Japanese project from Waseda University. We also see this, I think, as I was going through my slides, I realized was maybe particularly poignant for these days when we do have more social isolation and difficulty of having interactions with people physically. But robots have also been kind of envisioned as something that can be a kind of human presence. Maybe not a human presence, but at least a social presence that can bring kind of address issues of social isolation or in some way improve the quality of life and improve the way we can kind of communicate with technology as a different kind of more intuitive social interface. And finally, I think one other aspect of this discourse, which I think is quite interesting, is that robots have been talked about as a way to kind of bring more sophisticated technology, in a sense, to a less technologically literate user's level. And so Cynthia Brazil at the HRI conference in 2017 mentioned this as a way of democratizing access. So through the robot, you could actually connect to different kinds of communication systems, cloud information systems, et cetera, in ways that perhaps different types of users may not be able to through other means. So these are just some of the kind of themes in the field which talk about how having these kinds of robots might address social issues and also have an impact on society. But when we think about it as a kind of, these robots as a kind of fix, there are questions that don't always get brought up. And I think those are important questions to also take into account. There's somebody, I think, in the waiting room, but I can't admit them because my thing doesn't work. Sorry. So one of these things is, even though these visions of future robots seem very broad and inclusive, in a sense, they don't necessarily explicitly talk about what people they are helping, or who is being exactly affected, or whose quality of life is being improved. If we look beyond, if we kind of start reading the pictures, if we start reading the technology, the kind of spaces it's being used in, it does often assume certain types of users. And I think we can often assume that they're, upper middle class users with certain types of access to both the technology itself, but also to different kinds of services that can help maintain and set up the technology in their spaces. We can also think about the benefit, or something that often doesn't get talked about, is how these benefits of robotic technology may not be evenly distributed. So there's always the question of what kind of job you can roboticize, or what types of work might, I know we often talk about robots as not replacing, but actually assisting humans, but there is still some question of particular kinds of tasks being replaced. And so the question is, which tasks do we focus on to do this? And they're often things that perhaps, robotics researchers or others may not see as being particularly desirable. So we call them dull, dirty, dangerous. Or in some cases, it's even very specifically pointed out that it might be certain kinds of labor that are being kind of replaced by robots. So for example, in Japan, it's actually explicitly said that immigrants, robots can do things that otherwise might be, they might require immigrants to do, for example. So these things are not always explicitly, or not often explicitly, mentioned in projects, but they're kind of the background of what people are really talking about. And then I think another thing we don't do a lot of, and don't necessarily do very well, is this question of short versus long-term consequences. So like Astrid's work right now in thinking about what does long-term engagement with these things look like, and maybe not just in terms of the one-on-one interaction, but actually, I think there are various questions of how do you maintain these technologies? How do the relationships change over time? How do you have to change your space to accommodate them, and all these kinds of things? In the US, there's currently more interest in thinking about how work changes with the advent of these technologies. And so what kind of different infrastructure do you need to actually support robotic workers among us, for example? These are questions that are still just coming up. And so these are some of the things I want to kind of try to think about, think a little bit about today through some of our work. Another side of what I've always been intrigued by is also this this focus that we have more and more of, which is that now that we have the technology a little bit more figured out, which I think everybody who deals with robots knows how tentative that is, that statement is. You can actually, the idea is you could have robots in all kinds of everyday spaces. And so, robots in homes, robots in educational spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of this has been around for quite a while. And these two pictures are from more than 10 years ago. One is from Bill Gates. Bill Gates's article in the Scientific American, that's the one with the little house on the side. Another one is from the Robotic Society of Japan. But I think nowadays this is becoming more of, something of a reality. So we've already seen robots that people have in the homes like Roomba. We've seen robots that have almost gotten there, like Jibo, or they got there and then they stopped. But I think it's closer than it was then. But I don't think our vision has changed very much. And so one thing that I want to point out in these pictures, so if we take a look at the Bill Gates picture, which is the kind of floor plan, you'll notice there's several different kinds of robots there. There's a Roomba, there's something folding towels, there's one outside doing the grass mowing, and there's actually one person, this older adult that's lying in bed being served by a robot, and there's nobody else in there. And so this is a very lonely, depeopled kind of robotic space. And I'm thinking of that not just from the perspective of the older adult, but I'm actually thinking of it from the perspective like who's making sure these things work? Do we really think these things are just going to keep doing stuff all by themselves without a bunch of other support? And the other picture is in a sense similar. Oh, go ahead, Astrid.
And also the question, where are people then in future? Because our argument is always people, we will have more people who are older, who need care. Demography is increasing. Where are those people then? Where is space for all of these robots?
Yeah. Well, there's space if you have a large kind of, as I mentioned, upper middle class house with lots of special areas where your robot can hang out in the laundry room. But the other picture is kind of, it has more people in it, but it's still similar because really the only people in the picture are what we would consider the direct users, which are also often the only people that we really study, is how does the direct user interact with the robot? What's their perception? What's their response? And we kind of get stuck there. So one of the things that has been talked about in this space is from the perspective of social scientists looking into the space of robotics, is that a lot of this kind of vision actually erases much of the social that is actually crucial for robots. So Lucy Suchman has looked at kind of the development of robots and talked about how much the actual developers get lost in the picture. So I think everybody, if you've seen a robot demo, it's always like the robot is doing something by itself. It picked up a cup, this is great. But you don't actually see any of the hundreds of hours or thousands of hours, who knows how many, and the many, many people who just made that 1 minute happen, right? So this kind of social aspect of the work gets lost in the idea of robot autonomy. The thing that I want to focus on a little bit more is also that we lose the social side from the actual users. So how much, not just direct users, but even people around them have to do work in order to make the robots function in the way that we would like them to. So I'll show you a little video. One of the robots we've used very often in field studies because it's just out of the box is Paro. It's a robot seal. So that's the robot you'll see in this particular video. And so what you see here is just, it's a typical video of Paro in a nursing home, and you see people petting it. And the idea here is that the robot kind of inspires people to be more engaged, more active. They measure different things about their happiness. So both their perceptions of happiness as well as physiological measures of mood before and after interacting with the robot. And in mostly what comes out of this type of research is, we've put a technological intervention into the space, and here are the kind of social consequences or the psychological consequences that come out of this autonomous robot. But one of the things that one of the great things about Paro is that it's been studied for like 20 years or more. So at some point people started thinking like, well, is there something beyond? And so over time, things have been developed like guidelines for caregivers or guidelines for clinical staff in terms of how to use Paro or how to introduce Paro, which kind of suggests that it's not just Paro by itself is not enough. There are certain kinds of practices and narratives that have to come along with the robot so that it has these positive psychological effects. Was there a question? Sorry.
I was just briefly, I can also ask it later, but I was just wondering whether there are similar studies in these contexts just with pets, and what is the robotic specificity there?
Yeah, so sometimes there have been a few studies, not as many as you would think, of kind of comparing the robot or the Aibo, which is also another robot that has this pet-like feature. It's the Sony dog, with using pets for the same kind of thing. And it's basically, the interaction here is designed after the pet therapy interaction. So you introduce this pet-like thing that, people can touch and get some feedback from, and it responds, and then they can also engage with each other. So I think what is special about the robotic thing isn't necessarily so much in the perception of the direct user, the older adult. So there, the focus has been on, can this be kind of almost as good as the pet in terms of making people happier, or, more interactive, etc. But I think the extra benefit that's often mentioned is actually for others. So the robot doesn't go to the bathroom, and it doesn't need food. There are no robot rights right now that have to be taken into account. So you can put it back in its box right after it's done. You don't, in a sense, you don't have to take care of the robot as much, is part of the idea. But I think one of the aspects, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, in some of the work that we've done, is showing how there are actually other things you have to do because it's a robot and not a pet, or not a different kind of technology, which also take labor. It's just different kinds of labor. So this was all kind of under the guise, the theme of, using a robot as a technological fix for social things. And so STS folks have talked about other ways of considering how you might address social issues with technology in the mix. And so one thing that they've suggested is, well, let's think of it as a socio-technical fix. So let's add the social from the beginning to the equation and see what happens. And so thinking of it as a combination of tools and people, so not just the technology itself. So with this in mind, I'm going to just talk about some of the stuff we've done with robots in organizations and communities to see, like, okay, if you do take this more socio-technical people plus robots view, like, what do you see that might be different? And so over like the past 10 years or more, we've kind of done several studies of using Paro and then sometimes other robots in various, usually older adult oriented institutions. And so both in kind of observing some things in Japan, and then also in the US, and more recently we've been doing something in an intergenerational daycare, which is a community that serves both kids and older adults. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about these kind of more in situ field studies of the use of this kind of assistive robot. And some of the things we particularly were trying to look at is, what are the kind of social factors that affect how the robot is being used? So kind of looking beyond the robot, what kind of uses emerge, like how do people adopt these robots? And then what kind of robot features might fit into different kinds of organizational spaces. And so Paro has been really useful for us because in a sense, it was almost designed to be kind of a Rorschach test, as Sherry Turkle calls robots. This is just a statement from its main designer, Dr. Shibata, who says, Paro has a limited number of functions, but through the interaction with humans, it can expand its functions. So the idea here is there's already kind of this notion that it's really the humans who bring things to the interaction. It's not just about the robot itself. And so it immediately begs the question of, what do the humans bring to the interaction? What happens here? And so we've done kind of some shorter and some longer term studies in a nursing home, a local nursing home in the area, and kind of specifically using Paro in ways that it had been used in previous studies. So one of the ways that Paro is often used is in group interactions, where you see it in kind of the top picture. You have paro with a small group of people. And part of the idea there is that it can interact with one person, but also it actually engages others in interacting with each other. And then we've also put the robot into just kind of a voluntary use space. So somewhere, all of these nursing homes and spaces often have an area that's designated for kind of free form activities. So people do puzzles or read or sometimes watch TV together, or play a game or something. And so we put paro in one of those spaces to see what happens when people aren't kind of forced to interact with it. When does interaction happen and how? And so out of these different studies, some of the social factors that kind of emerged as salient are, well, one, kind of gender effects. So one thing that we saw consistently in just free-form observation is that women often interacted more directly than men. So they were interested equally in terms of paying attention to the robot, but the women would kind of go up and engage with the robot and start petting it and talking to it and doing more direct things more often. And paro is designed to encourage a kind of childlike interaction, or a infant-like, it's a baby seal, or a pet-like interaction. And so, one of the questions might be, is there something kind of more gender specific, particularly perhaps in the US space, of expressing those kinds of things in a public area in front of other people. Another thing in terms of this notion of kind of people plus technology that I was mentioning, in terms of thinking of this socio-technically, is that it became clear really quickly that the robot doesn't work without social mediation. So even in the group interactions, the therapist, when you observe what happens, the way that the therapist uses the robot, the way that they introduce it to individual people into the group, the way that they manage the group activity is crucial. Otherwise, you could put a toaster there almost, and you would have the same effect or lack of effect. In the voluntary interactions as well, one of the things we were expecting, because we had read some previous studies which had put paro in a public space and then asked the question and then shown that people actually interacted with each other around the robot, and they came and freely interacted with the robot. These were done in Japan. And then when we put paro out there, we actually saw that people ignored the robot more often than not. But then we studied, well, what happens if they actually interact with the robot? Is there something different from the times they ignored the robot? And it turned out that this kind of social mediation was really important there as well. So people were much more likely to engage with the robot if there was another person there. They were much more likely to engage with the robot if they had been introduced to it by another person before. Even though it's supposed to be a very intuitive kind of technology, because it basically reacts like, it looks like a stuffed animal, and then if you see that it's reacting, it's supposed to react, just like any animal or something would. So you'd think this is the easiest thing to use ever, unless you have somebody give you the narrative of, this is paro. You can play with it like an animal. You can treat it like a dog or cat or something. That intuitive interaction didn't necessarily start. And so we actually also saw a lot of what would be considered invisible labor performed by other people, various people around the robot, to kind of get these positive interactions with the older adults. So the staff would do this, but also the janitorial staff, who are really there to clean, would actually kind of go and chat with people and, around paro, and actually provide some kind of social interaction that isn't part of their job. So there was a lot of this invisible labor happening. Another thing that we noticed is that in the beginning, there were many people, particularly among the staff, who thought this was really actually kind of funny, and that the robot was a joke, basically, like, how could this do anything? But then over time, as they saw people interact with it, they actually started having more kind of creative ideas of what they could do with robots. And they ended up actually using the robot for more than a year in various ways, not in the study, but we just left it there. And so they used it in different ways. And I can actually tell you a little bit about those ways. So one thing we saw was individuals interpreted Paro differently. So different older adults did very different things with the robot. My personal favorite was one older adult who she was always kind of in the public spaces looking for someone to talk to. So she really wanted social interaction. And the only time she used the robot was actually when she saw somebody might be approaching, and then she would start interacting with the robot and use the robot to lure the person to talk to her. So she would never interact with the robot as its own kind of social engagement. It was more like a thing to get other people there. And then there were people who, used it as just a pet. There were other people who also used it as something to reflect with, which Sherry Turkle has also seen, basically talking about their own experience, but transferring it to the robot. So saying things like, have they left you here? Are you lonely? Isn't this a strange place? That kind of thing, talking about themselves through the robot. So individual users, older adults, used it very differently. The nurses also figured out their own kind of, how does this fit in well with us? So before we had been there, Paro had often in research been used in this group setting or in this voluntary setting. And they actually found that for their residents, the group setting did not work very well. But they actually ended up using the robot as a one-on-one therapy, and particularly in times when people were like very agitated, or they needed to be cleaned, or were in some situation that was unpleasant for them, they would kind of use Paro to distract them during that time, to make them less agitated. And we saw that so I've done some kind of visits to different places in Japan also that use Paro, and we saw this similar kind of appropriation where the robot is used as a kind of diversion. So people putting robots at the door of the nursing home so that older adults with dementia who might start wandering get distracted by the robot and don't wander, for example, and things like that. So this robot as diversion became, I think, quite popular, or having people interact with the robot if they couldn't participate in part of the activity, like exercise or something like that.
For the most part, we do.
Oop, that was just them talking about it, but we don't have to listen. And then we've done some comparisons. You asked about the comparison with actual pets, but we've done some comparisons with other of these pet-like robots. Recently in the US, we have something called Joyfrol, which is like a much cheaper version of Paro. Paro is about $3,000 and Joyfrol is $100. So, of course, the question is, could you use the much more cheap thing to do the same thing as the very expensive thing? And so we've kind of compared how people use these two robots in different institutions. And one, we saw different institutions using them differently. So we had a very labor-intensive institution where the staff were very busy, and they would kind of use the robot, as I just mentioned, to kind of distract patients in particular times so they could get their job done. And then there was a more easygoing institution where the work pace was slower. And so they would use the robot more as a kind of pet. But we also found that in the end, they actually preferred Paro. They found some of the features to be more robust, but everybody ended up with the cat. So they often, after our study, they would actually purchase their own version of the cat or the dog, because they could do things like leave it with the participants and not worry about it. And it actually solved some of their staffing problems. So the organizational set, it wasn't just the robustness and the quality and the features of the robot itself, but just some of these other external factors that affected how they might adopt it or not. Oops. Okay, I'm back. I don't know what happened. More recently, we've been doing work in this, as I mentioned, intergenerational daycare. So this has kids and older adults. And here we're kind of focusing on the community goals. So through these earlier older adult studies, we also kind of figured we need to think a little bit more about not just individual needs, like making one person happier or more relaxed or something, but kind of the community goals and needs that they have. So we've been trying to work on this in the intergenerational daycare. And one of the first studies we've done there is comparing several different kinds of robots to just see like what would they do with robots with different features. Does it make what makes the difference in terms of the kind of fit of features to the community needs and goals? So we picked 4 robots we had in the lab that seemed to make sense with some combination of older adults and children because they were used for those populations already. And we basically gave them to the community and watched them use them in something that they always had, which was these morning meetings of older adults and kids. So you can these are just videos of them during those morning meetings with the robots. And then what we tried to observe was how much having these kinds of robots, what kind of effect it had on the goal of these activities, which was basically to have kids and older adults somehow engage with each other. Because that's what the intergenerational daycare is for. It's kind of allowing older adults to have some access to an interaction with children, and then also allowing children to learn about aging and understand a little bit more what it's like to be with an older person. And so we tried, so if you see now is on one side, Paro is on the other side. And one thing that we noticed from these studies is that when we look at the goal of getting people to interact with each other rather than getting people to interact with the robot, some of the things that we tend to optimize for in design are actually the wrong thing to optimize for. So what we saw is that the robots that worked the best in this space were robots that had kind of a more easygoing and not so engaging style of interaction. So Paro was a hit for a few reasons. One was everybody had to get together to interact with Paro, so they actually had to be close. If you can see the kids and older adults together down there, which they can't do right now, so too bad. But that worked well because they were close together, but also it was ambiguous. So they had a lot to talk about and try out and kind of query around that robot. Now worked very well when it failed. So when it couldn't answer a question or when it took some time and left some space in the interaction, that's when the older adults and the kids could kind of engage more with each other and then also with thinking through about the robot. So one thing we thought was interesting here is that it really points out that if you're designing for this community goal of intergenerational interaction, making the robot very engaging is maybe not the point. You have to kind of look at a different style of interaction design. And what we saw later actually was that the community got its own robots. So some people got a donation, the intergenerational daycare itself purchased several robots, and now they're kind of incorporating them into different aspects of their daily life. So in interactions with kids, kind of daily pet visits, robot pet visits, as part of their exercise regimen, etc. So what we're doing now is kind of observing what happens over time and how do they use these over time. One thing that we also saw here is that they ended up needing kind of an additional labor force to help with these robots, which is student volunteers would often get the job of carrying the robots around and giving them to people for a certain time and making sure that they're used appropriately and things like that. So there's that notion of additional labor that's needed. I don't know if anybody has questions about this side of things, but if not, I can go to the next spot, which is just talking a little bit about the other notion of cultural effects. But does anybody have a question about what's happened so far before I forge ahead?
So there was nothing in the chat so far, so.
Okay.
By the way, sorry, I don't know if it's for everyone. For me, the chat is disabled.
Oh, well, that would explain it.
It may be an issue also with other. Okay, now it's active. Anyways, So depending on whether at the end of the talk, it would be possible also to ask questions for...
Yeah, it's possible anytime, but I was just thinking sometimes by the time the rest goes, your question disappears in your mind. So if anybody has something they want answered now, I can do it.
For me, it's not a problem. I'm taking notes and I don't want to interrupt the flow.
No problem. So this kind
there
of...
is one question though. Sorry.
Oh, good. Okay, go ahead.
So Kaylee MacArthur asks, there were feature differences mentioned between Paro and the cheaper robot. Could you elaborate on what types of differences these would be?
So it's Paro and the cheaper one.
Yeah.
So, okay. So Paro is, I would say, more technically robust to begin with. So it's really designed with very, and I think you can feel it when you hold it and you interact with it. It has very silent motors. You know, I've had a Paro for more than a decade and it still works, which I think is a miracle because I don't think I have any piece of technology that still works after a decade. It's supposed to have things like learning features. So when you interact with Paro in a certain way and you give it kind of positive reinforcement, so petting, or negative reinforcement, which is hitting, which, you know, we can think about how appropriate that is of a design interaction, but that's the way it's designed. You can actually have it learn what you like it to do. Like if you pet it every time you go, it goes, eh, maybe it'll go, eh, more. However, Paro is a closed system, so I don't know how that actually works, but people are told that and they do believe it and they see it as kind of becoming more personalized over time. And it's also put together by hand. So, so the parts get constructed together and the fur gets put on and kind of cut up and stuff by hand, which are all things that make it more expensive, as I'm told. The Joy for All has similar functions in the sense of it responds to touch, but you know, when you hold it, you can tell it's a less robust, less high quality piece of technology. Like it just seems more rickety. I think it feels more, how would I say, more, it's just less lifelike in a sense. But you can use it in much the similar way. So the interaction idea is they're both pet-like types of things. I also find maybe that because Paro is a seal, it's easier to just forget the fact that it's not very real, because none of us know how to, I mean, I know this was their design idea, but since none of us know what a seal is supposed to do, you don't get really upset by things like, you know, the robot cat just having this very awkward, you know, awkward movements that are not really cat-like, whereas cats are super graceful. This doesn't bother you with Paro because, you know, you can kind of imagine, okay, this is just what it's supposed to do. So I think the differences are kind of very qualitative, but people do notice them. It's just that they're not salient enough to kind of get beyond the other issues that they have, which is that it's expensive. It's hard to justify in their budget. Like they have to get extra dispensation to use that amount of money from their budget, whereas paying $100 or $200 or $300 or $500 is, you know, they can just spend that without asking anyone. And then also it ends up creating more labor because it's expensive. They're worried it's going to get broken or stolen or, you know, something will happen to it. So they actually they don't just leave it with the older adults, which actually creates more labor. I think that's a major concern. And they've actually had a case where because many of the older adults have different kinds of cognitive decline, one of the older adults who has dementia, you know, had somebody visiting and the visitor said like, oh, that's such a cool robot. And they were like, oh, do you want it? I'll give it to you for $20. And so, you know, they figured this out and the robot didn't leave, but it just takes a lot of labor to manage it more than the other ones. So I think that's their main concern.
Kaylee, she also thank you for your answer. There was another one by Shafali, I think. Can you elaborate on the fact that the community used to test Paro with its used to test Paro, which is then actually shaping its development further?
Yeah, so I think, so Paro's development is very much shaped. So I think it's a robot that's very controlled. As I mentioned, it's a closed system. So as a robotics researcher, I don't have an opportunity to change things in the robot. But I think the designers actually very much encourage and follow the different types of research. So every now and then, they do potentially make certain kinds of potentially changes in the robot itself. But I think Paro has become more of like an existing entity that you can place in different places and see reactions. But I think the development of the robot for me becomes more like, what can we learn from Paro that we can introduce into development with other things? So with the intergenerational community, we're actually working with Honda, who has their own desktop robot that they're interested in developing. And so now we're trying to figure out, can we use some of the things we've learned from Paro and from some of these other things to actually inform the design of this other robot that's open-ended so you can change what it does.
That was it for now. I think you can.
Great. I'll keep going. So the other notion that I've, in this discussion of technological fixes and socio-technical fixes that the SDS community has offered, and this is from a more anthropological perspective, is coming up with a cultural fix. So, and this, according to Linda Lane, is kind of a way of not just, connecting tools and people and answering this predefined problem, but actually figuring out how to redefine the problem and also developing new ways, new practices, new ways of understanding that you can use to kind of, that will be part of the solution to this problem as you've redefined it. And to me, this kind of connects well with the notion of participatory or more collaborative design with communities. So that's one of the things that we've also been engaging in with older adults. And so for the past, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, we've been doing, first we did a series of pilot studies, and now we're doing a bigger project with older adults who have depression and kind of trying to figure out what types of in-home technologies robotic technologies would be appropriate for them. And the focus that we've had so far is kind of thinking through how can we figure out what the issues really to address really are, and where the intersections of technology and these social issues lie. And then how can we figure out ways of working with these communities to think through the design of emerging technologies? Because one of the issues that we often have, and the people know in robotics, is one, people have preconceived ideas of robots that are extremely fantastical. So I'll show you some pictures very soon where, when you ask people just what would you like in a robot, they basically ask for a human that's not a human, but a robot, which is impossible to really create. So part of the question is, how do we learn from them, and how do we try to kind of show them what the technology actually does and what the capabilities are, so that we can have a more informed collaborative discussion on what we can do with this stuff. And so some of this work was inspired by literature, by these prior observations that we had, but also by a study that a couple of my students did, where we talked to some older adults about and showed them existing robotic technologies that were designed for them, and asked them about like what they would think of potentially using or not using, and why. And one of the main themes that came out of it is that people were very happy to say like, oh, this looks cool, but I don't want it. And of course, part of the I don't want it is like, I'm not sick enough, or I don't have a need yet for it. But the other part that they really reacted to very badly is the amount of kind of aging as disability that was inscribed in these technologies, where it's always like, aging is horrible. Here's what's bad about it. And here's how the robot is going to fix that for you. And so one of the things that, we learned from these interviews was also how people really think of their aging as, yes, sure, there are, you know, things change, you know, your body, I see this too, your body doesn't do as well with certain activities like staying up late forever as it used to before and things like that. But there are positive aspects to it too. Some people, you know, there's more time for hobbies, there's more time for social interaction, etc. So one of the things that they were requesting was really kind of also thinking through, how do you support these positive aspects and not just focus on the negative? And so what we tried to do through our initial participatory design work was kind of figure out how to do this mutual learning, as I was mentioning. And you don't have to worry about all these things, but this is just kind of the series of stuff we did. So we did interviews, we did several kind of different workshops over time where we kind of started from thinking through like, what are your issues and how do you experience them, to more introducing technology and then thinking about how the issues and the technology match with each other. And then along with older adults, we included clinical staff in these things at certain points, but actually often not with the older adults, so that we wouldn't have kind of a power issue there where older adults might not feel comfortable expressing certain things in front of therapists. And I can just show you some things that, you know, came out of this. So, you know, unsurprisingly, meeting people in their homes brought up a very different context for social robots than what we often see in either depictions or in lab studies, or sometimes even in field studies, depending on how you choose your population. So the right side, I don't know if it's the right side for you. You can see the kind of the pictures with robots in them, where everything is, it's an apartment, but it's nice and tidy. The places where we went to, and we particularly, you know, had lower socioeconomic level participants as well, you know, were not tidy necessarily. And they also had, just like, you know, I have a stack of boxes next to me right now, and things are constantly moving and people are throwing Legos. That was kind of how it was in these places as well. And so, but along with that, we also saw, you know, people expect older adults don't use technology, or they're technology phobic or something like that. That was definitely not the case. Like, everybody we talked to had a computer of some sort, you know, used it. Some people actually did like little jobs on the computer, like making their community newsletter. So technology was actually very much a part of their life, just, you know, not necessarily in the way that you might just expect from before. So so we kind of noticed those two things, which were interesting to us. We also talked to them about how to fit robots into their everyday context. And then there we saw like a huge variety of ways. So from kind of roboticizing existing equipment, like here, this is like a robotic coffee maker that tells you how to eat healthy, to kind of making the human as robot partner, which I was just mentioning on the other side. And then the other thing that emerged was kind of the notion that whenever they thought about robots, we also talked to them about kind of robots in the space of their home. And as soon as that happened, you know, they actually brought in other people. So even though all the people that we talked to lived by themselves, the robots were always presented in the context of their family, of their community, of other people who come visit them. So this was a little robot dog that one of the older adult participants thought she would like. And one of the things that she put in there, for example, was keeping an eye on the grandchildren. And one of the concerns many people had is, how is my family going to react to this? Or, you know, what is their interaction going to be like? Not just me. So there was really very much of a focus of this, even though it's in their home and they're supposedly the only person who lives there, you know, the robot actually had to be able to fit in with many other people beyond that particular user. We also kind of went through everyday interactions with robots. And so just what they would look like. These are just some pictures. And one of the things that the older adults often talked about was wanting to be kind of reminded, or reminded of what to eat, what not to eat, when to do certain things, exercise, etc. They also, what I thought was interesting, wanted the robot to manage their social interactions. So our older adults were older adults with depression. And so you would think like, okay, they would like to have, and many of them were socially isolated. So, they said they didn't get enough social interaction. But one of the main things they wanted the robot to do was to actually like check for people, like if somebody comes to the door, be able to answer the door and then say like, okay, come in or don't come in, or like, it's not time now, like they don't want to interact now and things like that. So, even if these are folks who would like more social interaction, it doesn't mean they want it all the time. And they want it in the same way. So having the robot as that kind of social manager was an interesting, I thought, point. But aside from including older adults, what we saw as being really important in terms of including the clinicians was that they actually sometimes were able to reinterpret the requests from the older adults in a way that I think was important to the design. So as I mentioned, the older adults often said they wanted the robots to give them kind of reminders or recommendations about how to do things. And we presented some of these ideas to the clinicians of like, these are the kinds of things the older adults suggested. And then one of the comments that really struck us was in terms of these recommendations, which is actually a very common robot like design goal, is how do we get robots to recommend certain things or nudge people to, walk or exercise or whatever. They said that, the older adult suggestion that the robot says, don't eat that, was actually not clinically appropriate. And that what they're trying to do through therapy is actually get people to be more independent and be able to make decisions on their own. And this would be contrary to that. And so instead of having the robot make these recommendations, what you wanted to do is actually have it engage the user in a conversation. So say things like, are you sure you want to eat that? Or, have you thought about going outside today? You haven't been outside for 2 days, or something like that. So where the decision is actually then, put on the person themselves, and you're developing their autonomy rather than kind of bossing them around and taking away from their autonomy. So I think this combination of kind of in the participatory design of taking very seriously the goals that the users are saying they would like to achieve, and the kinds of maybe ways that they want to achieve them, but also questioning those somewhat and figuring out from the broader community of what this kind of really means for them and for the broader goals of, what therapy is, or what these things are, I think is important. So bringing in more stakeholders aside from the direct user, perhaps. And then we've also been doing now these co-design activities in the intergenerational daycare. We're kind of working with them, developing a relationship with them consistently to see how we can actually work together to maybe design different kind of robotic technologies. And so we've done these, as I mentioned, observations of robots there. We've also just done observations of what they do on a day-to-day basis. And so we've tried to come up and see, like, if we use robots for the kinds of activities that they normally do, what does that look like? So I just have like a tiny video of Haru doing things like singing and doing a little game with them, which was inspired by that.
Would you like to play a game? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Why didn't the game? Is it a game that we have to find? What those things do you think? That's so silly that he's on. What is this game even called? What? Hey. Hi. I like this game. I like this game a lot. Hey, would you like to join us? Sure. This is the Muffin Man. I heard a song about this. What comes to your mind when you think of stars? I think they're so pretty. I think they're so giant. Some of them are so giant and make
So one of the things we've noticed from these just attempts, so the older adults and the kids normally do these activities without a robot. So one of the things we see when you stick a robot in there, the kids are really excited about the robot. The older adults are kind of like, but they do a lot of work managing the kid robot interaction. So they end up being the invisible labor basically in there. So I think one of the questions is how to make things more exciting for them as well, or perhaps that's actually a appropriate role in this kind of interaction. What we've also received recently from the community is like a request for a function to be served. So we're kind of excited about figuring out how to deal with this. During COVID, they found out that many of their older adults want to watch like TV and, but not just TV, like a soap opera, but actually, the opera at the Met or a concert or a virtual tour of a museum or all the things that we all are doing virtually now. But this takes up a lot of staff time because the older adults can't control the technology themselves. And so what they would like is something that would help them control the technology and have like a, set of things that they've defined that the older adults can watch and choose between. So what we're going to try to do is give them a like little robotic companion that can help them navigate these online things, but also that can maybe get them to talk to each other about them and have some engagement so that the TV watching isn't just people passively staring at the television, but they might actually have an opportunity to chat with each other about this.
Just quickly, I'd love to comment on that because it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago when we did the requirement analysis for the Hobbit robot, which was a robot built to enable independent living at home for as long as possible for older adults. Most of the people we worked with, of the older adults, also lived on their own for already quite some time. Loneliness was often discussed, and they also mentioned that they would love the robot as a TV watching partner. And the interesting thing was that they didn't explain it with the formal terms, but watching TV is a parasocial activity. When you're very lonely, watching people on television can give you the feeling of having social company. So they didn't want to have the robot as social company, but making this social company experience of watching TV, not feeling as a lonely activity.
Yeah.
And that was a very interesting insight for me. So they didn't want to have the robot as the actual companion. The TV served for this companion thing, but they wanted the robot to not make this companion situation felt a lonely experience. And that was a very interesting insight for me.
Yeah, we actually, so the people who did the ones that we did the participatory design with the older adults with depression who lived alone, they actually asked for the same thing. Like, I would like a robot to just watch TV with me and just chat with me a little bit about what's happening for probably the same reason. They didn't say, for that either, but it keeps coming up, this watching TV. But what we're hoping to do is to actually really turn it into you watch TV, but then talk to each other, because one of the things that happens is they watch TV, but they don't necessarily communicate about it. So they're all there. It's a group activity. There's like 4 or 5 older adults, but they're all watching TV, and then that's it. So
in our situation, several people also explained this, that they have the TV on the whole day, because then it sounds like they are not alone in the apartment. They hear people talking.
Yep, I've heard that too. Yep. So I'm almost in here, and then I think I would be so happy to just chat with you. But I just wanted to bring up, in terms of looking at these kind of community settings, what we've been trying to focus on is like, what is the community goal and how can we think about that in terms of either applying existing robots or trying to figure out designs for robots. And then the other thing we're trying to think about is, what are community level metrics? So like, we know how to measure, is the person happier before and after, or does the person like the robot, or have they like achieved some task? But if we're thinking of community level measures, like what are those? And I think both the organizational studies and the participatory design and these community studies have been really pointing to the need to think about more about the socio-technical, the infrastructure that you need to put in place, like both in terms of people and other technologies. And I mean, if we think of it even more broadly, like insurance, health insurance schemes, and ways that you can pay for and maintain this technology in order for it to really work in the long run. So just some things that we have as kind of our goals for things to think about further is kind of thinking more about these broader networks of technologies and users and other stakeholders. Then designing for things like reflexivity and agency of the users, addressing the community goals, but also the limitations. And then incorporating some of these broader concerns, like I mentioned, in the US, health insurance is a big problem and concern. And so, that always comes up, even though it's not a directly robot related thing that we can address, but we should kind of keep it in mind. And then creating more opportunities for this kind of collaborative design. And so I just want to say, sorry, my last thing was, rather than creating a socio-technical fix or a technological fix, we can kind of figure out how to design these socio-technical infrastructures and cultural systems that will allow people to actually dynamically solve their own problems over time, because the problems keep changing and their situations keep changing. So we also need to have something kind of more dynamic and responsive in that sense. So that's it for me. Thank you. And thank you to all of this is really done with and by students. So they're the ones that should get all the kudos. And of course, all of our partners and funders and those kinds of things. But I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you. Great, I'm gonna stop recording.
Oh, and I can stop sharing so we can see each other.